Okay, Chaver. So b'siyata d'shmai, we're going to jump back into our limud of Rabbi Nachman's Sichos HaRan. This is the third part already in Sichos HaRan Lamed Beis, where we had two parts already, and tonight we're going to finish off this very lengthy sicha on emunah b'siyata d'shmai. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so we can all see what's going on. And Be'ezer Hashem, let's share this Torah together. Okay. So the Hilchot Tzaddik says like this. We did this part inside last time, but I just want to reiterate and review it so that we can understand what the piece in the Kutamran that we're going to be learning is going off of. So let's begin with this section that comes toward the end of Sichos HaRan Lamed Beis. And the Tzaddik says, Ki yesh averos shemachnisim kfiras ba'adam. He says that there are averos, that there are sins, transgressions, shemachnisim kfiras ba'adam. They not only in and of themselves, obviously, are things that we should strive to stay away from, but they themselves are machnis kfiras ba'adam. They themselves can cause a person to a little bit be shaken away from emunah. Chazal tell us, avera garis avera, it's a lifestyle. And like we always say in the shiurim, it's not that a Kadosh Baruch Hu can't handle the idea or the thought of a person doing a certain action. So lo chpat lo, right? It doesn't really matter to a Kadosh Baruch Hu on the ultimate level. Chazal say this in Midrashim. The Sefer HaChinuch is marach about this. But at the root of an avera, like we learned recently from the Me'an Shiloach, what's the root of all averas, and that is something that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is choshesh from, so to speak, is the ego that sits at the essence of this, that a person chose to go after his own ratzon and to go after the ratzon Hashem, and chose to satisfy his or her own physical taivas, whatever that may be, other than reining that in for the purpose of living a more elevated life and letting HaKadosh Baruch Hu in, so to speak, where the Kotzker famously said that's where God is found, wherever we let him in. So that's, so to speak, what's bothersome about this whole concept of chait, is that it's not the individual action, but it's a general lifestyle. It's always deeper than the thing that we see on the surface. What's underneath the surface of a chait? What's underneath the surface of a chait, like we always say, is the word chait, which means to deviate, means to step off. It means to say that for that moment, we're not as focused on HaKadosh Baruch Hu as we should be. So there are averos that are machnis kfiras ba'adam, that bring a person further into this lifestyle of obscuring HaKadosh Baruch Hu's presence and the importance of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's will in our lives, and cause us to focus a little bit more on our own selfish and egotistical desires, rather than devoting our lives to serving the ultimate mission for which we came to this world, like we talked about in the Tasha Rebbe shiur, in the inner dimension, Parshas Bereishis, that the world is bara, that the world is a bar, it's a void. And Adam is Yatzar, Asher Yatzar Sa Adam, Miloshin positive Yitzira. That this is what we're here to do, is to reveal HaKadosh Baruch Hu's Ar, and to reveal the Kav, to reveal that Kav Hamid, that line of godliness that HaKadosh Baruch Hu sent down into the Halal, into that vacant space, and to allow that to become revealed in our consciousness, in our mind, in our relationships, in our choices, in our activities, in our behavior. So yesh aver shemachnisim kfiras ba'adam. V'yesh, there's another subset of people. Shebayim aleim achshavas al emunah machman shlei nolda b'kedusha karoi. Again, this is just reviewing what we had learned last time. There are those that come to this kind of struggle and come to this difficulty, recognizing the presence of a Kadosh Baruch Hu because of a certain lack of holiness with which they were brought into the world. And not only were they not born in the perfect way of Kedusha, which has an impact, like the Baal Tanya, like we spoke about, the Baal Tanya teaches in Parak Beis, there are those that added further on in terms of their own maseim harayim, in terms of their own negative actions. Like we said, there are activities, there are sins, there are transgressions that are mazik, that damage and blemish the person's clarity in terms of being able to stay focused on what is life about, what is this mission that we were sent here to accomplish. Says Rebbe Nachman, what's the tikkun? And we're going to learn about this very deeply in the Kutamran, and the piece on the bottom that we're going to learn. But the tikkun for this is busha, is shame, v'leiv nishbar, and a broken heart. Because a person who has these thoughts, like we spoke about last time at the end of the shiur, when a person has humility and a person begins to think a little bit beyond these things that we're so certain of. And we start to ask ourselves, where does this certainty come from? What do we really know? What do we really know about life? What do we really know about other people? What do we really know about the universe? How little we know. How little we know about how little we know. And it begins with humility, so then that leads to a leiv nishbar. A person should be full of shame, because again, even on the basic level, like we learned about, that pegamim and emunah, blemishes in this realm of being able to recognize HaKadosh Baruch Hu's presence, oftentimes come from a lack of holiness at our essence, so to speak, not on the essence of the soul, but on the essence of the guf, the physical body, which is a contribution of the parents, right? And so if there isn't kedusha in that element, obviously the neshama comes from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, neshama shenasat to be tahiri. We're not talking about the soul, but on the level of the levush, on the level of the body, and on the level of machshava, dibor, and maisa, which are, according to the Baal Tanya and the Nefesh HaChaim, all the tzaddikim, the Kedushas Levi, Marinayim, all the tzaddikim, machshava, dibor, and maisa are levushim for nefesh, ruach, and neshama. Nefesh is maisa, ruach is dibor, and neshama is machshava. And so these elements are focused in the body. And if a person has challenges in machshava, dibur, and maisa, the kedusha, what does that tell a person? That must mean that there's something rooted in the body that's not so pure, that's not perfectly pure. And that alone should give a person pause and reason to really focus and reason to say to oneself, maybe I have a lot of work to do. Maybe this isn't so indicative of such a positive element in terms of my body, that there's something missing, that I don't have. Or it's indicative of the fact that our own actions have led us to such a numbness, to such a lack of being able to perceive something that should be clear. That have caused a person to think thoughts that are neged, that are empty, that are against, so to speak, our holy faith. And the pasuk says about Midbar that the glory of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that the presence of Hashem fills the whole world. The pasuk in Yeshayahu, which we're all familiar with, the whole world is filled with the presence of God. And a person has thoughts to think that the world is just happenstance and that life doesn't have meaning, and that things aren't to be taken seriously in life, and that every thought and that every speech and every word and every action, we should pause before these behaviors and think to ourselves, is this being marabek kvod shemayim? Is this connected to the mission? And instead we go through life. And that's a reason for a thinking person to stop and to pause and to feel a little bit ashamed of that, to feel a little bit broken. That we have these thoughts that seek to push us away, that seek to uproot us from the living God, Asher Hu Chai HaChaim, who's the life of all life. He's Baruch, he is Ala Shemai, who's uplifted and who's blessed. And we don't even have to go ahead, we don't even have to try to be marich and explain what kind of busha, what kind of shame a person should feel. When a person sort of, sometimes we get put in our place by others, sometimes we could put ourselves in our own place. That's what a spodidus is all about. You take an hour, you take a half hour, you take 20 minutes, you take time off and you sit a little bit and you reflect. Like, who do I think I am? What is this whole thing about? I couldn't create myself. Like I mentioned to somebody recently, if it were given over to us to run our bodies, forget about our lives, or the world, but to run our physiological functions, digestion, the pulmonary system, the heart pumping blood throughout the body, our mental processes, and all the different functionalities of memory and emotions and stuff, just to run that for a split second, it would be not just like it would be impossible. It would be, impossible is not the word. Our body in and of itself that we take for granted. How many of us thought about the functionality of our body today, even though how many times do we say Asher Yatzar in the last week? How many times do we actually think about, like, this is a pella pili plus? Even on our worst day, even the most sedentary, person just sitting and not doing anything, it's a pili plus. It's a miracle. It's a miracle. So we sit for some time and we're misboning on this, and we think about this deeply, and we put ourselves in our own place. And we open our eyes up to the miracle, to the wonder of life, and to the import of living, how important life is, how meaningful life is, mamish, every minute, every second. And we think to ourselves, I had machshavas that are pushing me away from emunah. We don't necessarily mean kfira, kapshuta. It doesn't mean that a person is becoming an apikoros. It doesn't mean this. but it means that I live a majority or a bulk of my life outside of this consciousness. Hayatachen, how could it be? There are things that I'm more conscious of than God. I am more frequently aware of my need to eat than HaKadosh Baruch Hu's need to become revealed in the world through me, right? All of these ideas, and this is what Espodidus is for, should lead to a busha. Through this, that a person feels this busha of a leiv nishbar and this brokenheartedness. This can bring a person back to the straight and narrow. This can bring a person back into connection with the purity of youth that we speak about before the world got to us. And before we began, like we mentioned last time, or I think in the Parsha shiur, before we began to be patient, like we spoke about. Why is it that children are so impatient? So we mentioned because they come from a realm l'malam and azman, but as life goes on, we get used to this world. And we realize, okay, there's a thing called patience, there's a thing called the guf, there's a thing called walking and standing and eating and sleeping, and we get used to this. Emunah brings us back to that innocence, to that purity, that simplicity, where it's pashut, and we're not a chakrid, and we're not a sophisticated adult. There's no child philosophers. Children can be very, very talented. We don't find child philosophers. Philosophy is something that's removed from them because they're pashtanim. Because children are filled with a spirit of tamimus and pshitas. And we're trying to get back to that. We're trying to get back to that princess, right? That we lose baderech, asher karcha baderech, that a malik, who's the cool, rational philosopher, comes to cool us off. And emunah pshuta means that I'm a child again. Emunah pshuta means that I'm logical again. I can think like an adult, like a logical person, without having so many veils in the way, preventing me from seeing life as it really is, people as they really are. To get back to a place before my eyes became clouded with all sorts of technicalities of what it means to live in this world and certain assumptions that we make about relationships and what's possible and what's not possible, rooted in this worldliness and the guf. Busha shivran leiv can bring us back to that place where anything's possible if it's holy, where Mashiach is not only a possibility, but he's coming already, he's here now. If we can open our eyes to it, where the world is a miraculous, wondrous place. And that's what a Shah Espoididus is for. Busha leiv nishbar. And this, of course, brings to the deepest joy, as we're going to learn in a moment, but it brings us back to that clear way of looking at the world, that to the world is bizarre, but is the most sensible, logical, yashar way of living life. In a way that's without airs, in a way that's without facades, in a way that just is real. This is what we're about. And Yiddishkeit is not something that we do, but it permeates every cell of our bodies from the minute that we wake up and the minute we go to sleep. It's just who we are. Every conversation that we have, no matter what the conversation is about God, is about Yiddishkeit, right? This is a consciousness. Busha leiv nishbar brings us back to this clarity. So before going further, I want to jump into this teaching from Likutei Moharan that's so deep. It's not so long. It's a little bit more compact. And the reason for this is because it comes from the Chaverim. It's called Lashon Chaverim. These are Torahs that were recorded by the Hasidim, by the Breslover Hasidim, before Reb Nosson got there. And so they're not written super clearly. They're a little bit more concise and a little bit more cryptic, I think, because of the way that they were written. But ultimately, Reb Nosson records them, and he says, I've recorded them, even though some of them are very difficult, because there's gems, mamish gems here. So listen to this Torah from Rabbeinu. It's so deep and it's so beautiful. It's so beautiful. The pasuk in Tehillim says, Zivche Elokim Ruach Nishbara. A carbon to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Zevach Elokim, is a Ruach Nishbara, is a broken heart. Person has a broken heart, it's a little bit mizbeach. It's a little bit returning to HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the deepest way through the avoid of a carbon, which comes milashon lekarev, right? To come close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, ruach nishbara. It doesn't get better than that. Karev Hashem l'nishbrei leiv. Karev is a carbon. Karev Hashem l'nishbrei leiv. That's also another expression of this pasuk with zivche elikim, which is a carbon. Karev ruach nishbara l'nishbrei leiv. Hini yadua, says the Rebbe Chusi Agudalenu, ki oila ba al hir halev. Chazal tell us that the reason that we bring a carbon oila is specifically not on the maisa of the chet, but on the thought of the chet. That's the oila. Oila is an inyan of machshava, because machshava takes place in the highest part of who we are, in our brain, right? Above which it's just air, it's not me anymore, right? So thinking takes place in my oila, in my aliyah, in the attic, so to speak, of my physiological makeup and structure. And so the carbon oila relates to that element that takes place at the rosh of me, at that place of the oila, hirhuri alev, the thoughts of one's heart, the thoughts of one's mind. The pasuk says in Yecheskel, ha'oila aruchachem. Ha'oila aruchachem is a question, meaning to say, has it arisen in your minds? Meaning, is this what you were thinking? So we see that oila could be connected to the nakuda of thought. And this is a medrash that says that this is why we bring the carbon oila. Hainu. So oila ba al hirhur halev. That's why the oila comes into the world. Our hirhur halev, on the thoughts of a person's mind. Shesham mishkan ruach, where we have the ruach of a person, in the lave of a person is the ruach. Shesham mishkan ruach. And this is why the heart oxygenizes all the blood that flows through the body. We take in a deep breath, and that enables the heart to oxygenize the blood and then sends oxygen to the whole body. That's the inyan of ruach. And ruach is the mishkan of the ruach is in the lave. And there are thoughts of the mind. There are also thoughts of the heart. Of course, it takes place in the mind, but it manifests in the passions of the heart. And this is this pasuk, ha'oila al ruchachem, which is talking about thought. That's the inyan of ruach, which is the machshavas of the lave, and it's connected to the concept of the carbon oila. Ha'oila al ruchachem. Ve'ein Hashem Yisbarach mitzaref machshava l'maisa. But we know that Chazal tell us, the Gemara in Kiddushin, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is not mitzaref machshava ra'a l'maisa, machshava toiva he is. But if a person has a negative thought and plans to do something, HaKadosh Baruch Hu does not consider that as if the person did that action. Bar mehuhuri akum. Except for Hurhure Akum, the thoughts of non-Jews, Kiviyachol. And this is what the Gemara tells us about the spiritual source of the nations of the world that aren't rooted in Kedusha per se. Ultimately, they also have a tikkun, and this is why over Sukkot we're bringing karbanos dafka for the nations of the world. And la'asad lava kibesi beis tfili kar l'chala amim, and so on and so forth. But they're not naturally rooted in Kedusha at all. The shalosh klibas atmeis legamri, they're not rooted in Kedusha. And so the thoughts of a non-Jew are more essential to their makeup spiritually and physically than they are to that of a Jew. And therefore, HaKadosh Baruch Hu will consider it as if they went ahead and actually acted it out, because ultimately that's really what they wanted to do. But by a Yid, we have this unbelievable level of understanding that a Jew is rooted in exalted levels of Kedushas. Unbelievable, the level of holiness that a Yid is rooted in. And therefore, machshava ra to a Yid, when a Jew has a thought or plans to do something negative, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is not mitzaref l'maisa, because that wasn't really what he wanted. And it's not as if necessarily, if all of the right elements were in place, for sure he would have done it. It's not true, because you didn't have that baskal of shuvu banim shevavim echoing within our hearts all the time. And who knows, last minute we would have been pulled back to the tzad hatov that's echoing within us, masha'ein kain, the non-Jew. That's what the literal level of the Gemara in Kiddushin means. It says Rebbe Nachman deeper. He says, V'hira akam shayach kol adam. It doesn't just mean the thoughts of non-Jews, a thought that a non-Jew has, but each and every one of us inside have a little bit hira akum. We also sometimes can have thought processes that are ultimately affected and caused by this, that we're in gullus, by the nations of the world, Shibud Malchias. But we have that element of Hirhuri Akum. He gives an example. He says a person tries to daven, and at the beginning of davening, he's with fire, and he's focusing, and he's concentrating. Or a person spends some time alone, and he's trying to speak to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and he's trying to think about the purpose of life. And in the middle of tefillah, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, all of a sudden, he just falls down, and the clarity that he had and the open channel that he was experiencing to converse with the HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to connect with the HaKadosh Baruch Hu, was gone. This is an element also of Hurhuri Akum, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is mitzaref l'maisa. Now, what does this mean that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is mitzaref these machshavas l'maisa? In what sense? Obviously not in the same sense as the literal understanding that the machshavas of non-Jews are considered as if they carried out those desires. So Rebbe Nachman clarifies. He says, where does this come from? That we have a nefila, any kind of nefila at all, which we naturally associate with doing things wrong, right? Or acting in a way of taiva as opposed to a way of intellect, as opposed to a way of maturity, as opposed to a way of humanity, but letting that base animal tendency take over and compel us into acting in ways or reacting in ways or emoting in ways or speaking in ways and so on and so forth that don't align with the upper part of who we are. But ultimately, it doesn't necessarily have to mean that. It doesn't have to mean an action. It could also mean a way of thinking. It can mean a lifestyle, those things that we're machshiv, those things that we value. Any nefila, ba machmas kilkel emunah, it's rooted in a kilkel emunah. It means to say that our emunah, that our, not even faith, that our recognition of HaKadosh Baruch Hu is not so strong. And when that happens, and we, so to speak, turn our face from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, nimsa machzir panav me'Hashem Yisbarach, what's happening? It means that I turn my face away from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Doesn't mean that anything necessarily happened objectively in terms of HaKadosh Baruch Hu being more revealed or less revealed, because that's totally on us. And so that means if I'm having a trouble in emunah and a struggle, it's not because God isn't there, it's because I turned my back on him. Now, that itself can be caused by actions that we take, like we learned, Averis machnisim kfiris ba'adam, giving into taivas, even when we do understand that it's not the right thing to do objectively and that there is a God who's watching, but that can have hashpa, that can have an impact. And on whatever level, on whatever plane, it means that I'm turning my back on HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And when that happens, he says, or Kamosha Kasa, the Pasuk Yeshayahu says, Nazayru acha, we turned away. We turned backwards. We turned our back on Hashem. And of course, this doesn't mean physically we turned away, but it means that our whole life is lived. Kiviyachol, we're looking down. We're looking at artzius. We're focused on our physicality as opposed to our soul. We're focused on the physicality of the world as opposed to the soul of the world, which is HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And of course, those two things are correlated. And the more that we're focusing on our gashmias, the more the world's gashmias seems more real to us. And the more that we're focusing on our chelik elokami mal, and the more that we're working day in, day out, no matter what we're doing, even if it's not overtly spiritual, even if it's just achila and shasiya and shena, sleeping, eating, drinking, but we do it and we engage in all of those behaviors with our chelik elokami mal in mind, memela, that's going to sensitize us to the spirituality of the world as well. So these two things are related. We don't just have to have emunah in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but we have to have emunah in ourselves. What does that mean in ourselves? In the chelik of HaKadosh Baruch Hu that we contain, because these two things are related. And the more emunah that a person has that there's an HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the world, kiviyachol, the more emunah we have to be able to realize that physicality is a facade, and that beyond that physicality is a spiritual realm where HaKadosh Baruch Hu is shining. The more we're able to look at our bodies and say, hey, it's a joke. This is not who I really am. No, this is just a kli. This is just a vessel for the spirituality that I have inside of me. This is very, very deep. These two things are connected very deeply. I'm writing about this now. I'm writing a sefer of Ziyat Lishmaya on Torah Vav, on the 6th lesson of Likutei Moharan, and a marich on this. It goes much deeper than this as well, but this is at least one chelik and one level of that. So a kilkul of emunah means that I turn my back on Hashem. It means that I'm living life with my head facing downward. Like we learn, like Rebbe Nachman says, and I bring it in the book in a footnote, Rebbe Nachman says, did you look up at the sky today? What does that mean that you look up at the sky today? Not simply that a person should lift up his head physically and look at the sky. Of course, it means that. But it means, are we living in a way of himel? Are we living in a way like the pasuk says, Su'u maro minechem, lift your eyes on high, Ru'u mi bara eileh, to be able to live with the consciousness of the Creator. What is life about? But instead we get caught up in this world. And the more that happens, it means the less I'm looking up at the sky. The less I'm focused on the me, bara eileh, on the singular Creator that binds all the disparity of this world together. That means the less that it's su'u mara minechem. That means that the more that I'm facing downward, the more that I'm turning away from HaKadosh Baruch Hu in my thoughts, in my speech, and my actions. Rahman al. Guess what happens next, says the Rebbe. Hashem Yisbarach gamkin master panav mimenu. The result of that is going to be further concealment. Not because HaKadosh Baruch Hu is angry, and not because it's a punishment, but because this is the teva of the way that HaKadosh Baruch Hu set up the world, that the kruvim, which are used to, or which are ordinarily facing one another when they're bound up in deepest love, when one turns away, the other one turns away. And it's not simply because it's a reaction on the part of kruv number two, to the action of kruv number one. It's mamish like there's something mechanical about it. Anytime you turn one of them, the other one turns around. That's the way that the world is arranged. That's the way that the world has been built and is set up. And so the more that we are turning away, so to speak, from this reality of there being a HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the world, the more that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has mastered himself, the more that he hides himself, like the Kruvim, and that's what the Kruvim represent. Hashem is Baruch Hamkin, master pun of me, man. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu will also hide himself a little bit more with Midas Adin. Of course, for the purpose of giving us space to further find him and to be margish, hey, I'm so distant. But at the end of the day, Rebbe Nachman says, however we're going to understand this, nimsa hu achar ba'achar. What emerges is that we have a matziv, a situation of back to back, not face to face. Achar ba'achar. The kruvim turned away from each other. Says Rebbe Nachman, this is why we need to bring in oila. In oila, on this shiur akum, that's mitzaref l'maisa, which means to say that has an impact in our lives, even though it's just a shiur, but it's a shiur akum, and it comes from a realm that's rooted in tumah, which means a realm that's rooted in a lack of perception of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and a realm that's ego focused and that's focused on the physical and not on the spiritual. And when that happens, it's mitzaref l'maisa that has an impact on our lives. What did we say we need to do to be masakin for these hirhurim in oila? We have to bring in oila. What's in oila? B'tzarech lahavi alza oila, says Rabbi Nachman, so deep. This is such a deep Torah we're learning now. It's very, very deep. I could spend the next 2 hours probably talking about this. We have more to do, but this is very, very deep. It needs a lot of yishuv hadas. The godless of Rabbeinu HaKadosh. There's no one like him. There's no one who came close. Such a level of gilui. Ashreinu 1 billion times. We don't know what we have. We don't know what we have. What a privilege. And thank you for learning it with me. Says the Rebbe, B'chinas oila hu kishemishaver as ruche b'kirba. You know what it is to bring a carbon oila in 2021? Means shivron lev. Again, this is very connected to the Sicha that we're learning. We talked about Pagam and Emunah. How do you fix it? Shivron Lev and Busha. Says the Rebbe, that's the oila that we're bringing. When a person breaks his heart within himself. And he's embarrassed. And he thinks to himself, how did I fall? How could I be in a circumstance where I'm rooted in an element of Shamayim? This is our chelek. This is what Am Yisrael is in the world to do. Hashem, to be able to be an Or LaGoyim, to be the one nation rooted in the clarity of the innocence, of the tamimus, of the pshitos, of heavenly chelek, of being able to perceive the ruchnius of the world and then communicate that to others in our thoughts, in our words, in our actions. To look down and to have my whole life focused on dvarim gashmiyim, on artsiyim, that my conversation should be about this worldliness. Who cares? What a waste. What a way. We're not talking halachically. Is a person allowed to talk about? Is a person not allowed to talk about this worldly things? They get into conversations about this and that and the other thing and spend all of our time chatting about this worldliness. But who has time for this? A Yid is rooted in the Nakud of Shamayim. Conversations need to be focused ultimately on that. Now, of course, we live pragmatic lives. We're in this world. But ultimately, our primary focus, like the Baal Shem HaKadosh wanted to teach us in Keser Shem Tov, to all of the generations until Mashiach is coming, and this is our task to give this over to our students, to our children, to our friends. The Baal Shem HaKadosh said, I want that my Hasidim, that my students, and all of Am Yisrael, that wherever they look, they should see God first, and then the thing that they're looking at. Person looks at a chair, he says a shtik elokus, and then he sees a chair, right? And that means that wherever a person looks, what's registering is the Indian of Shamayim, because that's our chelek. That's where we come from. That's the Shirish Nishmas Yisrael is rooted in the bays of Bereshis, Bishvil Yisrael Shenikra Rashis. We are the Rashis. We're rooted in that place of Rashis, in the Bishvil, in the why, not the what, how, where, when. Leave that to the 70 nations of the world. All the details, all the inventions, all the scientific discoveries, nations of the world. Not to say if there's anything wrong with engaging in any of these activities. Certainly not if a person's able to find HaKadosh Baruch Hu in that Matov Manoim. But Am Yisrael's unique chelek is the why. And never, ever, 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 ever to lose touch with that on any level. To get caught up in this world, to forget why we're here. We're only here for a short period of time, not to lose sight of that. So he's asking himself, we're asking ourselves, I was rooted in such a lofty place. And kazeh can also be a remez to the nevu of Moshe Rabbeinu, aspaklaria de nahara, aspaklaria meira. That Moshe Rabbeinu was able to point with his finger, and this was his difference in nevuah than all of the other prophets. So that Moshe was nesnaba bezeh. He was able to say this, zeh, and the rest were b'koi. It was a little bit more vague. How could it be that I fell from the Indian of Kusnas or with an aleph, the garments of light, to be able to reveal that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the one that created this world, and that he encloses himself within the world, not to conceal himself, but to reveal himself. And instead of doing that, I fell down into a place of koi and far, far below that. And I'm living a life that's out of touch with this. And that I get caught up in this worldliness and conversations and thoughts and worries and daigas about this world. And therefore, I turn my back on HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and one crew turns around, the other crew turns around. Nimsa, we're back to back. This is such a deep line. And he has Rachmanas on himself. Can there be more Rachmanas on a Malach Alekim Tzvakos, which each of us are inside higher than the angel? The angels are jealous of us. The angels have to wait until we say Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh Lamatos, that they can say Kadosh Lamala. And we get caught up in the same thing that the rest of the world is caught up in the same culture. Again, not even talking like, not even on that level, but just to realize who we are. We're different. We're mamish different. And we get caught up in this, and to see our children and our teenagers getting caught up in like mamish, like if it wasn't for the mitzvahs that they schlepped themselves through, you wouldn't know the difference. And we want to shake them. And of course we have to do so gently, but to let them know, do you know how precious you are? Do you know how exalted you are? The mission for which you were sent down to this world, the glorious chain of heaven that you're connected to, that spans creation from beginning of time to the end of time, that the whole entire world is all about us and for us. Tav Rachmanas, Kein Rachmanas Gedola Mizu. And this is an important line also, because so many times when we fall into matzavim like this, Rachmanas is the last thing we have for ourselves. And we're beating ourselves up, and we're a failure, and you'll never amount to anything, you can never do it. Rebbe Nachman introduces and suggests a whole different response. It's Rachmanos, to be merachem al atzmai, and to say, I'm not a failure. For a second, I stepped off of the path that I still deeply yearn to take and to follow. That's the inyan of chet, and to mamash have Rachmanos on himself. That's what a person should feel when a person's in a matzav like this. Shivron leiv, brokenness, not atzvos, not depression. Shivron leiv, and to then have Rachmanos. How great I am, deep, deep, deep inside. The haneshama shenasata bi tahirei. It's still pure. To have Rachmanos on that, and to say, Rebbe Shalom, I want nothing more than to fulfill the potential for which you sent me down into this world. But in order to do this, in order to go ahead and to find some way to turn back face to face, because before we're back to back, the kruvim, the only way to become turned around and to see HaKadosh Baruch Hu again face to face, v'tzarich lazen nesira. This needs a cutting. A cutting. Where do we find the concept of a cutting? Come on, show you Eitzel Adam Arishan, the Gemara tells us that Adam Arishan, according to one opinion, shenever du partsufim achar ba'achar, that Adam and Chava were actually created back to back, attached, with two faces on either side. And then HaKadosh Baruch Hu went through the process of cutting and sawing them apart, kiviyachol, and then to rebuild them as two separate individuals where they could then turn around and face one another again. Vanasira hu b'chinas chatach, shem chatach, chaf, taf, ches, taf, chaf, rather. It's a very holy name. It's the name of Parnasa. This Nasira, and it means to cut. Chituch means a cut. Chaticha, it's a piece of. So this holy name, Chatach, is the element of this Nasira, of this sawing apart of Adam and Chava. And Chava, of course, is Malchus, Knesset Yisrael, and Adam is a Kodesh Baruch, is the Adam Elyon, Adam Yoshev al Kisei. And Kamei Shekasa, the pasuk says, Poseach es yodecha. You open up your hand, umasbial l'chol chayratzin, and the Sofei Tevis of Poseach es yodecha is this holy name. Sofei Tevis Chatach. We need to utilize this element to become sawed apart from a Kadosh Baruch Hu, and not to exist in a place of back to back, but to turn around face to face. How do we do this? Do you know how to go ahead and to activate this holy element of being able to saw ourselves apart, kiviyachol, to then come face to face again with Hashem? The inyan is Shivron Lev. However, this is so deep, so deep. When a person is in a matzav of Shivron Lev, there's deep breathing that happens in that process, and a person's breathing heavily, or a person's sighing, and a person needs to breathe in, and a person needs to breathe out. The whole Indian is in a kud of ruach, who train ruchin. And therefore, there's an element of 2 times ruach in this process of Shivron Lev, because it involves a great deal of slow breathing, of contemplation, almost like a conscious sleep. When a person is sleeping from the rest of the world, and a person goes, like Rebbe Nachman describes in Likutei Moharan Nun Beis, when a person separates oneself from the rest of the world at a time of night, and a person goes ahead and connects himself with that element of just deep breathing, setting time aside to focus on what's really real in life. Train ruach. Ushnei pa'amim ruach, and 2 times the word ruach is gematria chatach, which means to cut. So how do you go ahead and affect this nasira between Adam and Chava, between Am Yisrael and HaKadosh Baruch Hu, when we're in a matzav of achar ba'achar, the kruvim facing away from one another? Shivron Lev. Because Shivron Lev involves 2 times ruach, this deep breathing, this sighing, this krechzing, this process of deep contemplation that involves slow breathing in and out, 2 times ruach, and 2 times ruach is gematria chatach, which means to cut. And this is the element of how we're able to cut ourselves apart, so to speak, from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, ba'el b'chinas panim b'panim, and to come back to see HaKadosh Baruch Hu face to face, v'zeh b'chinas oyla. And this is the nakud of an oyla, of the carbon oyla that we're bringing. V'zeh, and this is pshat in the pasuk, ziv chelikim. Do you want to know how to bring an oyla, which comes to be mechaper on those thoughts, ha'oilal ruchachem, which are related to the hiruri akum that I'm mitzaref lemaisa, to affect my life lemaisa, that causes me to turn my back on a Kadosh Baruch Hu, and a Kadosh Baruch Hu, therefore, in response, to further conceal himself, so that we're in a matzav of achar ba'achar. How do we do that? Zivche elikim, with a carbon, is ruach nishbar, is the broken heart. That's dafka ruach nishbara, because 2 times ruach is gematria chatach, and that's the shame that's able to cut apart Adam from Chava, who are created back to back, to then enable them to come face to face and to see each other for the first time. However, this is a phenomenally deep Torah. I just want to focus on one element of this, on one beautiful, beautiful thing that comes out of this. Sometimes when we're in a matzav of achar ba'achar, and we're in a matzav where we're not conscious of a Kadosh Baruch Hu, we feel that a Kadosh Baruch Hu in kind is concealing himself from us, or it's due to the concealment that we're distancing ourselves from a Kadosh Baruch Hu. We naturally perceive this circumstance not only to be one of our turning away from a Kadosh Baruch Hu and a Kadosh Baruch Hu turning away from us, but that there's a phenomenal distance between us and HaKadosh Baruch Hu at that time. In obviously not physical proximity, but in terms of our capacity to reach out and touch him, right? In terms of our capacity to reconnect ourselves with him, because we're in a matzav where we're looking in one direction, achar, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu is looking in another direction, kiviyachol, achar, and we say to ourselves, there must be a merchak rav. There must be an enormous, enormous, enormous distance and gulf and a vast chasm between us and HaKadosh Baruch Hu as well. The most beautiful thing that comes out of this lesson, and there's a lot of beautiful things and practical things that come out of this lesson, is the realization that paradoxically, and this is counterintuitive and bizarre, but it's true, in a time that we're achar ba'achar, we're actually closer in proximity to HaKadosh Baruch Hu than when we're panim b'panim. Unbelievable. Because even though we're in a matziv of achar ba'achar, even though we're each facing in opposite directions, and it seems that we're so distant from who we are deeply inside at our core, but this is a matziv of Adam and Chava, Koidem and Asira, where they're part and parcel of one another. It's like a thought of like a couple, nobody should never know from such a thing, a couple that gets into a spat and gets into an argument, and they're not even holding where they could talk to one another. But sometimes, they could sit on the couch and they can't even look at one another, but they're sitting back to back, right? They're sitting back to back, and they're together in that experience. And in a certain way, they're further than ever before, but in a certain way, Gewalt, they're closer than ever before. And in a certain way, this experience of achar ba'achar, then after going through the nesira of chatach, of 2 times ruach, of shivron leiv, and ruach nishbara, that brings to a much deeper connection afterwards if we made it through. And if we were able to heal these scars in a way that makes the skin tougher than before, it makes it much more difficult to open that skin up again. Because we healed that void. We healed that split between us and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And in a time of achar ba'achar, we have to remember it could be, and it is true, that because of our mistaken perspective, we're not focused on Hashem, and it must be that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Hashem tzilcha, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is our shadow, the 2 kruvim, turns himself in some way in the opposite direction as well. But we have to realize that at that very moment, and this is part of the tikkun, this is part and parcel of the shivron leiv that we feel then, that Rebbe Nachman says here, sheyisi b'makom gavoya kazeh, brings us back to the realization and the reminder that I'm a chelek elokam imau. We may be achar ba'achar, but I'm a part of him, and he's a part of me. And so there's no such thing as distance. There's no such thing as a chasm. It means for the moment, we're not in a place where we can look at one another, so to speak. And for the moment, because of whatever challenge I'm going through, it isn't clear to me that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is in my life in a way of gilui. But let that never obscure the essential connection that we have, even stronger in a time of achar ba'achar, like Adam and Chava, who are part and parcel of the same body, but they can't see each other. Then when they are cut from one another and can then turn around and face each other as separate beings, but can then interact. This is a very, very deep nekuda. And I think that this is what Rebbe Nachman means to tell us. This is part of the mirachim al atzmai. That we're not in a bira amikta in some deep pit down on the floor and it's impossible to climb out. Mirachim al atzmai. To be able to have mercy on who it is that we really are deep down inside. That I'm deeply rooted and I belong in a very lofty place. I'm a chelik of Hashem and Hashem is a chelik of me. That brings to shivron leiv. When we realize what I could be and how deeply I could be living this reality in a way of consciousness and a way of panim bepanim, and yet I live in a way of achar ba'achar. It's specifically the revelation that in a time of achar ba'achar, we're like Adam and Chava facing in opposite directions of a part and parcel of one another, part and parcel of HaKadosh Baruch Hu and HaKadosh Baruch Hu, part and parcel of me, that brings me to the state of ruach nishbara, 2 times ruach, gematria chatach, chituch, to be able to cut and have an asira, to split us apart, kibiyachol, for the purpose of then turning us around, to be able to face each other in the deepest, deepest, deepest and most loving manner. That's a very, very deep idea and a deep, I think, remes that Rebbe Nachman is hinting to us, a deep implication of this very glorious and little-known teaching in the Sichos HaRan, Kuf Ches. So thank you so much for learning that with me. With the last couple of minutes, let's finish the piece from Sichos HaRan and sort of speed through the second 2 sources that are less deep. Of course, they're so deep, but it's going to be easier to get through in the last 10 minutes that we have together. So let's go back into the piece from Sichos HaRan. We finished the first paragraph, which again is talking about the tikkun for a lack of emunah, which is busha and shivron lev. We discussed that at length, and we saw the piece from Likutei Moharan that aligns with this and that demonstrates, how that process works. And over here, the tzaddik continues and he says about emes, and the truth is emunah hu inyan chazak ma'od. It's such a strong thing, faith. The chayav in a person's life who lives with emunah chazakim ma'od are so powerful, is so strong. Ayidei emunah, through emunah. Kikishi yesh le emunah, when a person has faith and lives with faith, and not just on an intellectual level, but it's deeply rooted within him, and it informs the way that he responds to circumstances. Of course, we're all a work in progress, but to some degree, even if a person goes through terrible suffering, we should never know from such a thing, he's able to give himself some comfort, to enliven himself by saying, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is filled with mercy, and he's running my life, and he knows what he's doing. And it's going to be good in the end. And all the struggles that I'm going through, they're only for my best. And they're for meaning, they're for purpose, not stam. And the end is going to be good, whether it's in this lifetime, whether it's in the next lifetime. Everything's for a purpose. But a philosopher, that doesn't believe in a personal God, maybe in a concept of a first cause, but in a personal God that's mashkiach on every single thing in the world, that everything in the world is for a purpose, is with reason. When all of a sudden he goes through something, he has no one to turn to. How is the atheist going to comfort himself? The world is absurd. It's just a world of absurdity. Things happen. There's no rhyme or reason. Where is the element of being able to encourage oneself? And to comfort himself, to console himself. And he says, a wise person will understand these things on his own. And will understand one thing from the next thing. It's impossible to explain these things so well in the written word, but it has to be lived. But the main thing is emunah. There's a sheet in the Rishonim that holds that Kriya Shema is not a mitzvah in and of itself, a separate mitzvah, because it's bound up with the mitzvah of emunah, and emunah isn't a mitzvah. It's not counted as one of the mitzvahs because the whole Torah is Kriya Shema, because the whole Torah is a mitzvah. That it's not a separate mitzvah in the minyan mitzvahs. I can't remember. Maybe it's Rasadi going. I can't remember. One of the Rishonim holds this. Unbelievable. This is the whole Torah. This is the essence of Yiddishkeit. Is this consciousness? It's not about how many things you do right and how many things you might do wrong. It's far deeper than that. It's a consciousness that the Torah and mitzvahs are supposed to help us foster. Belishum chakir is klal, without any sophistication, because that's already on the side of adult. And the whole thing of emunah is to bring us back into the innocence, into the simplicity, into the straightforwardness, into the sensibleness of little children. In this way, a person will be strong in this world and the next world, and will never stumble. Fortunate is such a person. Famously, there was a social philosopher, a political philosopher, Karl Marx. I believe he was a Yid also. Karl Marx, the founder of communism and the communistic worldview. And he famously said about religion, he called it the opium of the masses. Religion is the opium of the masses. What did he mean? He meant that he saw religion as simply a false created construct, Rahman al-Islam, created by men for the purpose of numbing their pain, of giving them the ability to numb their pain, much like opium. Obviously, it's probably much more beneficial to a person than actually ingesting any kind of drug or mood-altering substance. But ultimately, he denigrated it as being the opium of the masses. And the deepest thing is that a person who understands HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and a person who understands what life is about, and a person who looks around at the world and has the very childlike, simple-minded realization that this must have been created, and that the Torah is too vast and too deep to have been a human construct, and things are too consistent across too great a period of time, and that the Jewish nation is miraculous, and so on and so forth. Whatever brings a person to this realization actually comes back to be moided to Karl Marx. It's a pellet. Because all of us would say the same thing. Religion is the opium of the masses. Because it was given to us by HaKadosh Baruch Hu for the purpose of enabling us to live a life of comfort, not because it's sheker and it's the opium of some negative way of numbing our pain because we're immature and we can't deal with it, but because the master of the world that designed life gave us an opium, gave us something that we can use to enable us to live life with grandeur and with such an elevated perspective on the things that we go through. It is the opium of the masses. Karl Marx, you're absolutely correct. But it's the opium that was gifted to us by the master of the world to enable us to overcome the challenges of this worldliness. And so the last few minutes we have left, let's just finish this piece. Gam zois tzarich ladas, a person needs to also know Rebbe Nachman wants us to know that there are people who never, ever, ever, ever struggle in emunah. They just don't. Ever met that stereotypical, Israeli cab driver? Never struggles in emunah. Okay, might not keep the Torah and mitzvahs, and okay, we have to daven for all of our Jewish brethren to be connected with all 10 fingers plugged in. But the emunah, just never struggled with that. And you can talk about philosophy and this and all these chakiris and sveikas. Just doesn't have an impact. And it doesn't confuse him at all. That's like speaking about the drive for physical gratification in the way of intimacy in front of a person that's just a saris, that doesn't have that capacity. So it's not going to arouse that which just isn't part of that being, right? It just doesn't speak to him at all. He just doesn't have the capacity for that kind of behavior. There are certain tzaddikim einam shoymim klal. It just doesn't go in because they're so strong in their faith that nothing could shake it. And they realize that anything that comes to shake their faith is part and parcel of their faith. That HaKadosh Baruch Hu made a world like this so that we can have bechira, and they're able to understand the place of doubt in the scheme of things, but they don't allow Amalek to cool them off at all, not at all. Then Nichnas name cloud just doesn't go in their ears, and it looks like we're going to be running out of time, so we'll probably just finish this piece in Sichos HaRan, and I'll be sending out the sheets, and so you can just look. It's two easy pieces, pretty simple reads from the Kara Kemach. On Purim, it's kedai really, if you have Kara Kemach, to go through the whole piece. It's unbelievably brilliant and beautiful. And the Archas Hadikim Shar Simcha. So you can go through that on your own, where they speak about this, further this inyan of how life of emunah is so strong and is so full of joy and is so full of strength and is so full of confidence and courage. But Rebbe Nachman over here finishes where he says, he says the doubts and all of the thoughts and the questions and the confusions of the Hamoin Am of people in Shtusim Gedolim. They themselves are incredibly foolish and are fali ve'inam kushis klal, and they're not real questions. The ish b'nei adam shalchem em eza kushis man rav. Person goes with a deep question of emsa kushish lehu teretz, right? And really, this thing that he's so confused about actually contains an answer. Actually contains the seeds to a deeper way of understanding things, but it appears to like a question. And it gives an example. It took me a lot of time to really understand this, or Tzvi Ari Rosenfeld helped me understand this a little bit in his recordings, but he says, when you ask a little child, the child broke a window, and you ask him, do you think, or why would we take the piece of glass of a second window and put it in the first window? Why would we do that if the bird will just fly through the second window? What are we going to gain? There's a broken window here. We have two panes of glass. And we ask the child, why would we do that? Why would we take the glass from one window and put it in the other window if a bird's just going to fly right in through the second window anyway? Now, when you ask a child this question, where you include the answer within the question, which means to say that that itself is the reason why we shouldn't do it, right? I mean, you're asking him, why should we take the pane of glass out of window A and put it in window B if the bird's just going to fly through window A? And that is not a question, it's an answer. You're right. Because the bird's going to fly through the pane anyway, probably shouldn't do it because it's not going to make a difference. But when you ask the child this question, it's bewildering to him. The any adam al hashav klal doesn't know. Like, why should we do that? It's an excellent question. Why should we take out the pane and put it in the second if the bird's just going to fly through in? And it's not a kushya, it's a teretz. That's why we shouldn't do it. Weiter, right? But he spends time like it's some sort of riddle. It's not a riddle. It's straightforward. It's a shtus hakushya sheyifrach hatzipor. This question, that why should we do this if the bird's going to fly in hu teretz ala kushya rishano shel shtus, is the answer to why we're actually not going to go ahead and do this. Listen, in truth, that's why we're not going to take the glass out and put it in the second thing, because it's going to cause nothing. It's not going to help us. The bird's going to fly in regardless. But the child just doesn't understand the function of the question, begins to think that there's some sort of deep esoteric riddle here and can't wrap his mind around it and wonders about this. Doesn't understand that you're actually stating something instead of asking a question. And this is a very deep thing. We don't have time now to go into it. We're out of time. But just one nekuda is that the world views life as a big question mark. It's a big, big question mark. And they begin with certain assumptions. Now that there can't be a creator just because that's too bizarre and it's too removed from our experience and we don't believe in such things. So now we have all sorts of questions about the world. Why are things the way they are? Like, why is the Teva of Eish to go up and the Teva of Mayim to go down? And we look at them and we're like, these are not questions, Bichlal. These are not questions, these are statements. The world is not a question mark. It's a statement that is very straightforward. But again, we lose the childlike innocence that enables us to approach life this way. And so we overthink everything. And the philosopher's whole thing is that he overthinks. But the inyan of emunah is to go back to that purity of youth, to that clear-minded focus where we're not confused by the riddle that is the world, because we're not taken by the assumption that it's a riddle. Because it's straightforward and we have clarity into what life is about, and we don't let go of this for a minute. That's what Rebbe Nachman uses this line. He says, we put the kushya ima teretz biyachad, but the question contains the answer, and the answer is in the question. This is exactly how it is with people. And they have all of these questions and all these bewilderments, like what is this and where did this come? Science and design and who did this? But they don't ever come to the realization that it's not a question, because there's a creator who's intelligent and designed it all, and everything has a meaning, and he gave us a Torah that contains the code, and we should probably go ahead and spend time unraveling the code to then understand all of these things that we were struggling with. And that is this function of this kind of lifestyle where we're just trying to be simple. And we're just trying to be Yidden, and we're just trying to hold on to this element of anachnu ma'aminim, v'nei ma'aminim alekeinu, v'alekei aveseinu, like we spoke about in previous shiur and Lamed Beis. I think the first year, unbelievably, he says here, ach machmas chesron avanasei nid malai shu kushi gedola. And we should understand this well. It came to get this out of our minds and to run away from this whole kind of lifestyle of overthinking and of doubting and of questioning and of wondering. The opium, Gewalt, what a privilege. We were given this gift, and it's not an opium of sheker, it's an opium of emes, mamish, to enable us to live a life that's chaim chazakim. And in order to get to this, and with this we'll finish, there has to be shivra and lev. And there has to be this nekuda of chatach, shtei pa'am, and ruach, to take off time and to sigh over this, that we're so holy and we're so exalted and we have such a mission and we're in this world to do something so incredibly powerful, and we get sucked into the limitations of this world and we believe in them and we trust them, and we don't live on this level of just fire, just unbelievable confidence. Lo choshesh min haolam. How could we be? We have this incredible mission. We know what's right, so let's do it. Let's just do it. Each of us can do it. We have to do it. HaKadosh Baruch Hu has no one else in the world but us, and He trusts us more than He trusted any generation. We live in a time of Hester and a time of Achar v'Achar, so we need this hour or this time, however much time it is, whenever it is, of Shivron Lev and Busha, to then cut us apart, Kiviyachol, and to bring us face to face, panim b'panim. I bless us b'siyata d'shmaya. We should be zeicha to live this life of emunah, to live a life that's chazak, to live a life that's innocent, to live a life that's pure, to live a life that's clear, not to get caught up in the sophisticated adult confusions that we so often settle into, but to fight for simplicity, to fight for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We have a gift, Chevra. We were given a gift. Yiddishkeit is not a burden. It's not even an obligation that we have to do. It's an unbelievable gift. Ashreinu, 1,000 times we should be zeicha to give this over, this real Jewish pride, not like Jewish pride. Mom is Jewish pride, to understand what is a Jew and why we should be prideful about it. To be able to connect to HaKadosh Baruch Hu on the level of Su'umar Menechem Ru'u Mi Bara'ela Be'ezer Hashem. We should be zeicha to continue to foster this consciousness together, B'siyata d'shmaya. So thank you all for joining. I really do appreciate it. What a privilege. Like I always say, there's certain Giluyim and Chidushim. I don't really prepare for these shiurim. There's certain siyata d'shmaya that comes down, and it's not me. It's all because of this special, incredible inyan. Almost like it says by Yaakov that all the shepherds gathered together, and together they pushed the rock off the well, like the Degamach Ephraim says. It's all of us together. So thank you for being a part of it. Mamash Ashreinu. Wishing you the best rest of the week, and we will see you Thursday evening, I hope, if I have the privilege of doing so. Okay, have a wonderful, wonderful night. Thank you, Chevra, for joining. All the best. Chazak v'ematz. Thank you, Chevra.